In the autumn of 1942, on a country estate 40 minutes north of London, a Scottish aristocrat named Lord Aberfeldy walked the manicured grounds of a magnificent house, arm in arm with a German general. The two men spoke in fluent German. They discussed the war, the weather, the menu for that evening's dinner. The Scottish lord listened sympathetically as the general complained about the food rations and the cold English nights. He offered to make purchases for the general on his next trip into London. He carried letters to and from the general's family in Germany, hand-delivered through the Red Cross. The general, an experienced commander who had led panzer divisions across 2 continents, considered Lord Aberfeldy a friend, a welcome bridge between the brutal reality of captivity and the world of civilized European nobility. There was just one problem with this arrangement. Lord Aberfeldy did not exist. The man wearing the title was an officer of MI-19 named Ian Munro, working under a false name, and the conversations he was carefully steering, with leading questions asked at exactly the right physical locations on the property, were being recorded by hidden microphones and transcribed in a basement room by Jewish refugees who had escaped Hitler's Germany years before. Over the next 3 years, this estate would record 65,000 conversations between Adolf Hitler's most senior captured officers, totaling roughly 120,000 hours of audio and 10,000 pages of typed transcript. The men recorded did not know they were being recorded. They believed they were among friends. And what they said, when they thought no one was listening, would not be declassified until the late 1990s. When a German historian named Sönke Neitzel finally pulled the boxes from the British archives in November of 2001, he found himself reading words that demolished, line by line, almost everything Germany had told itself about the Wehrmacht for 50 years. This is what Hitler's generals said when they thought no one was listening. And what they said about the Americans was the part that, even now, still hits the hardest. The estate was called Trent Park. Before the war, it had belonged to Sir Philip Sassoon, a fabulously wealthy British politician and member of the Sassoon and Rothschild families, who had used the property to entertain royalty, prime ministers, and Hollywood stars. The grounds were extensive. The mansion itself was impressive without being ostentatious, the kind of house designed for long weekends of conversation by people who could afford to have long weekends of conversation. When the British War Office requisitioned the property in 1939, the original architecture was kept almost entirely intact. The library remained. The billiard room remained. The drawing rooms with their windows overlooking the lawns remained. What changed was hidden inside the walls. Microphones were installed in light fittings, in fireplaces, in flower pots, in skirting boards, in floorboards, and famously inside the felt of the snooker table itself. Microphones were installed in trees in the garden so that prisoners walking the grounds in apparent privacy could be recorded as cleanly as if they were sitting in an interrogation room. A purpose-built listening station, known internally as the M Room, was constructed in the basement, eventually staffed by some 50 German-speaking listeners working in shifts of up to 8 hours at a time. The operation was run by an MI-19 officer named Thomas Kendrick, a veteran of British intelligence work in pre-war Vienna. Kendrick understood something that most interrogators did not. Men who are tortured will tell you whatever they think you want to hear. Men who are comfortable, well-fed, and convinced they are among gentlemen will tell you the truth. Trent Park was designed, from its excellent food to its supervised day trips into London for shopping at Harrods, from its whiskey rations to its Lord Aberfeldy, to make the most senior captured officers in the German military comfortable enough to confess everything. The first general arrived in August of 1942. His name was Ludwig Kruvel, a panzer commander who had served as Rommel's deputy in North Africa and who had been captured in May of that year when his reconnaissance plane mistakenly landed behind British lines. Kruvel was a committed National Socialist. He believed in Hitler. He believed Germany was going to win the war. And he believed that Hitler's achievements would, as he put it during one recorded conversation, last for centuries. When he was placed at Trent Park, he immediately set about establishing himself as the senior figure among the prisoners and the guardian of German military honor. 3 months later, on the 20th of November, 1942, the British delivered him a roommate. Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma was, on paper, the kind of officer Crüwell should have respected without reservation. Thoma had been one of the original architects of German armored warfare. He had commanded panzer forces in the Spanish Civil War. He had led the 20th Panzer Division on the Eastern Front. He had finished his career as the commander of the Afrika Corps under Rommel, until he was captured at El Alamein in November of 1942, fighting at the front with his men. He held the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man Crüwell expected to find in agreement with him. He was not. Thoma despised Hitler. He thought the Führer belonged, in his own recorded words, in a padded cell. He thought the entire Nazi government was a gang of rogues who, after the war, ought to be sentenced to hard labor. He believed Germany had already lost. He believed it had deserved to lose. The two generals spent their first night together at Trent Park, arguing into the early morning hours. Every word was recorded. The British listeners in the basement could not believe their luck. What followed, over the next 18 months, was one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations of the 20th century. As more German generals were captured and shipped to Trent Park, 84 officers in total over the course of the war, with up to 59 generals present at any given time, they sorted themselves into two factions. Around Crüwell gathered the unrepentant Nazis, men like the paratroop general Bernhard Ramke, who arrived later from the breast pocket, and various others who continued to believe in Hitler even as the war turned against Germany. Around Thoma gathered the dissidents and the realists, including the Luftwaffe general Gerhard Bassenge, who had been captured in Tunisia, and a steady stream of officers who had seen enough of the war to know how it would end. The two factions fought, sometimes literally, over the radio in the common room. When Thoma's people tuned in to BBC broadcasts, Crüwell would march in and physically change the station to a German channel mid-program. They argued at meals. They argued on the lawns. They argued during the elaborate dinners the British hosted to keep them talking. And every word, every grievance, every careless boast and bitter complaint went down through the floorboards into the M room, was captured on glass disc gramophone recorders by listeners wearing headphones, and was transcribed onto paper that would sit in a British archive for the next 60 years. Almost none of the prisoners suspected. A few, occasionally, wondered out loud whether the rooms might be bugged, but they always talked themselves out of it. One of them is recorded saying, with what reads now as almost unbearable irony, that the British were too stupid to bug their conversations. It was during one of these arguments, on the 22nd of March 1943, that General Wilhelm von Thoma made what may have been the single most expensive indiscretion of the entire war. He was talking with Crüwell about the future, about what Germany still had in reserve, about the secret weapons programs that, even in defeat, might still turn the tide. Thoma had personally visited the Kummersdorf test site, west of Berlin. He had been there with Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the German army. He had seen, with his own eyes, rockets being tested, rockets that could travel, in his own recorded words, 15 kilometers into the stratosphere. He could not understand why London was not already in ruins. He could not understand why these weapons were not yet in use. He laid out, casually, in detail, in the privacy of what he believed to be a private conversation between two German generals, the existence of what would become the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs. The British listeners in the basement transcribed every word. Within weeks, British scientific intelligence was treating the German rocket program as a top priority target. Reconnaissance flights over Peenemünde, the Baltic facility where the rockets were being developed in secret, brought back photographs in May and June of 1,943 that showed unmistakable rocket bodies on test stands. On the night of the 17th of August 1943, Nearly 600 RAF heavy bombers attacked Peenemünde. The raid killed senior scientists, destroyed test infrastructure, and set the V-2 program back by months. Some historians believe Thomas' conversation alone may have shortened the war by half a year. He never knew. He died in his hometown of Dachau in 1948, 3 years after his release, never having been told that the Peenemünde raid traced back to a single evening of careless bragging in a London mansion. But the V-2 disclosure, dramatic as it was not the most revealing material to come out of Trent Park. The deeper revelation, the thing the transcripts tell us that almost nothing else in the historical record can, was what these men actually thought about the war they were fighting, and specifically, what they thought about the Americans. The contempt that German officers had felt for American soldiers in 1942 and early 1943 is well documented. Hermann Göring famously dismissed American industrial capacity by sneering that Americans only knew how to make razor blades. Nazi propaganda described America as a decadent mongrel nation, weakened by jazz music and Hollywood and Jewish financiers, incapable of real sacrifice. When German forces under Rommel shattered green American troops at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, killing or wounding over 6,000 soldiers in just a few days, the propaganda seemed confirmed. But by 1944, the men sitting in Trent Park's drawing rooms had stopped repeating that line. What they said instead, when they thought they were alone, was something altogether different. They talked about the artillery. They talked about it constantly. General Heinrich Eberbach, a panzer commander, captured in France in August of 1944, described in conversations recorded at Trent Park the experience of trying to move armored units in Normandy under a sky that belonged completely to the Allies. Every road, every crossroads, every patch of cover was watched. Every column that moved in daylight was hit. Every position that revealed itself, with even a wisp of smoke, was, within minutes, the target of a kind of artillery concentration the German army had not previously known existed. The Americans had developed a technique called time on target, in which multiple artillery batteries calculated the exact flight time of their shells from different positions and fired at staggered intervals so that every round arrived at the target in the same instant. There was no warning, no ranging shots, no opportunity to take cover. One moment, a meadow was empty. The next moment, it was carved into craters. German veterans interviewed after the war repeatedly described American time-on-target barrages as the most terrifying thing they had ever experienced, including those who had served years on the Eastern Front. At Trent Park, generals who had commanded entire armies described the same helplessness in their own voices, recorded into glass discs they would never see. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, in Normandy during the summer of 1944. He was caught in the target zone of Operation Cobra on July 25th, when approximately 2,500 American aircraft dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs on a strip of Norman countryside, 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. Bayerlein was not at Trent Park. He survived the bombardment and was captured later, ending up in different facilities. But what he wrote after the war for the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies program mirrored almost word for word what other German generals were saying in their secretly recorded conversations at Trent Park during the same period. The bombing, he wrote, created a feeling of helplessness, weakness, and inferiority that broke men who had survived everything else. Soldiers who emerged from cover were dazed and unable to function. The carefully prepared defensive positions that had held American forces at bay for weeks were obliterated in hours. Bayerlein had served in every major theater. He had fought in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, in North Africa under Rommel, on the Eastern Front. He had seen Stalingrad. He had seen El Alamein. About Operation Cobra, he wrote one sentence that, more than any other, captured what fighting Americans really meant. For me, who during this war was in every theater committed at the points of the main effort. This was the worst I ever saw, the worst he ever saw. Not the Eastern Front, where millions died. Not the desert. The carpet bombing at Saint-Lô. At Trent Park, men who had commanded forces in those same campaigns said similar things into hidden microphones, in the privacy of what they believed to be a gentleman's club. They talked about what it felt like to give an order and watch it disappear into a wall of incoming fire that could not be answered. They talked about the radio, the American walkie-talkie, the small, handheld device that meant a single forward observer could summon hundreds of guns onto a position within minutes. German veterans later said the crackle of an American walkie-talkie was the most feared sound on the Western Front. At Trent Park, in conversations recorded 18 months before the war ended, generals were already saying it. There was something else they talked about, and this is where the transcripts move from military analysis into something much darker. The conversations recorded at Trent Park did not stay confined to artillery and air power. As the men relaxed into the false comfort of the estate, with Lord Aberfeldy bringing them whiskey and the library well stocked, and the food, by the standards of wartime Europe, abundant, they began to talk about what they had done, about what they had seen, about what they had ordered. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the man who would become famous for refusing Hitler's order to destroy Paris before its liberation in August of 1944, was recorded at Trent Park in conversation with von Thoma. Choltitz, who had been celebrated by the French and the Americans as the man who saved a city, confessed to Thoma that during his command in the Crimea in 1941 and 1942, he had participated directly in the murder of Jewish civilians. He used the word liquidation. He spoke about it with the casualness of a man recounting an administrative detail. He was not boasting. He was not justifying. He was simply describing, to a man he believed to be a sympathetic colleague, the work he had done in the East. Almost every senior officer at Trent Park, the transcripts later showed, either knew about the Holocaust in detail or had been directly involved in some part of its execution. The conversations included candid discussions of mass shootings, of pre-dug graves, of the systematic murder of Soviet prisoners of war, of the killing of Polish intellectuals, of every category of crime that would eventually be enumerated at Nuremberg. Some officers expressed genuine horror at what had been done. General Paul von Felbert, sentenced to death in absentia by Hitler for surrendering his garrison too quickly, was disgusted by the war crimes he had heard about. Others were chillingly indifferent. General Heinrich Kittel complained to the SS not about the murder of Jews itself, but about the fact that mass executions were being carried out in public locations where the gravesites might contaminate his troops' drinking water. The transcripts demolished, in their own voices, the post-war legend that the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, had remained somehow clean and separate from the crimes of the SS. Trent Park made it impossible, after declassification, to argue that anymore. The generals had said it themselves, in their own words, when they thought no one was listening. By March of 1945, with Germany collapsing and the war days from over, an officer at Trent Park named General Ferdinand Heim was already rehearsing what would become, within months, the standard defense at the Nuremberg trials. "We must uphold the principle," he told his comrades in a conversation recorded and transcribed by the men in the basement, of only having carried out orders. He was not the only one. Throughout 1944 and 1945, as defeat became inevitable and individual prosecution became foreseeable, the generals at Trent Park spent more and more of their time experimenting with phrases that would become familiar at Nuremberg. They blamed the SS. They claimed they had not known. They claimed they had not been involved. They constructed, in real time, the legal and moral architecture of the post-war legend that the British listeners in the basement could already, before the trials had even begun, document as a lie. A few of them broke under the weight of what they had done. General von Choltitz, after his confession to Thoma, said something that Sönke Neitzel quotes in his book, and that has haunted historians ever since. "We all share the guilt," Choltitz said. "We went along with everything, and we half took the Nazis seriously, instead of saying, 'To hell with you and your stupid nonsense.' I misled my soldiers into believing this rubbish. I feel utterly ashamed of myself." He was, the transcripts show, one of the few. Unquote. Most of his colleagues were already, by 1945, polishing the lies they would carry to their graves. The men listening to all of this, transcribing it, translating it from German into English in shifts that ran 24 hours a day in a basement room with no natural light, were almost all Jewish refugees. They had escaped Germany or Austria as children or young adults in the late 1930s. They had lost family in the camps. They had lost everything. Many of them had been granted emergency British or American citizenship specifically so they could be employed in this work. They sat in the M room with their headphones on and listened to German generals discuss the murder of their relatives in Crimea, in Poland, in Belarus, in Ukraine. With the casual indifference of men discussing the weather, they transcribed every word. They translated every word. They handed the typed pages up the chain to MI-19 analysts who built intelligence reports from what they read. And then they went home at the end of their shifts, and they did not, under the terms of the Official Secrets Act, tell anyone what they had heard. The work was classified. The records were classified. The very existence of Trent Park as an intelligence facility was classified. Many of the listeners died decades later without ever speaking publicly about what they had done in the war. The few who lived long enough to see declassification, men like Fritz Lustig, who had fled Berlin as a young man and ended up in the M room as a British soldier, listening to his country's generals confess to genocide, gave interviews in their 90s that, even now, are difficult to read. They had, all those years ago, won a kind of victory. They had recorded the truth of what Hitler's army had done in the army's own voices, before any of those voices had a chance to clean themselves up for posterity. And then they had been ordered to keep it a secret for 60 years. The transcripts sat in British and American archives, indexed but unread, until the late 1990s, when British policy on the Second World War archives began to shift toward full declassification. In November of 2001, the German military historian Sönke Neitzel was researching naval operations in the British National Archives at Kew when he stumbled across a reference to recordings of German U-boat officers. He requested the file. The file existed. Inside it were transcripts of conversations he had not known existed, recorded in places he had not known had been recording. He kept pulling files. The pile grew. By the time he was finished, he had identified roughly 150,000 pages of secretly recorded German military conversations sitting in the British and American archives, almost none of them previously studied by historians. He published his first book on the material, Tapping Hitler's Generals, in 2007. He followed it in Zweitausend Delft with Soldaten, co-written with the social psychologist Harold Welzer, which used the broader pool of recorded conversations from ordinary German soldiers to understand how men, trained in modern democracies, had become capable of the violence of the Eastern Front. Both books, when they appeared in English translation, forced a generation of military historians to revise their basic assumptions. The legend of the clean Wehrmacht was already in trouble by the early 2000s. Trent Park finished it. The recordings did not just confirm what historians suspected about who knew what. They documented it, in the voices of the perpetrators themselves, with a level of detail that no post-war memoir or interrogation transcript could match. What survives now, of all of this, is the paper. The mansion at Trent Park still stands. It was used as a teacher training college after the war, then as part of Middlesex University, and is now in the process of being converted into a museum and luxury apartments. The grounds are still beautiful. The trees the British hid microphones inside have been replaced by their descendants. The basement room where Jewish refugees transcribed the genocide in real time is empty. The men who lived there, on both sides of the floorboards, are gone. Creuel died in 1958 inches, Essen, having lived out a comfortable post-war life and never publicly acknowledging the role of his bugged conversations in compromising the German rocket program. Thoma died in 1948 of a heart attack in his hometown of Dachau, of all places. His leg amputated during his final year of British captivity. Never told what his careless boast about Kummersdorf had cost his country. Choltitz lived until 1966, lecturing about his refusal to destroy Paris, never publicly mentioning what he had told Thoma about the Crimea. Bayerlein died in 1970. Eberbach in 1992. The last of the Trent Park generals were gone before Sönke Neitzel ever pulled the first file. The last of the listeners are nearly all gone now too. The transcripts remain. 150,000 pages of voices from a vanished world, speaking truths they never intended anyone to hear, recorded by men whose families they had helped to murder, sitting now in climate-controlled archives in London and Washington, available to anyone who wants to read them. What they tell us, in the end, is something the men themselves never quite said out loud, even at Trent Park, even when they thought they were alone. They had not been beaten by better soldiers. They knew that. They said so repeatedly in their bugged conversations. They had been beaten by a system, by a nation that could pile up artillery shells faster than they could be fired, that could replace every destroyed tank with 2 more within a week, that could put fighter bombers over every road in France from dawn to dusk, by a country whose forward observers carried radios and whose radios called down storms of steel that no German position could survive. The generals at Trent Park, when they thought no one was listening, said all of this clearly. They also said something else. They said they had served a regime that deserved to lose. Some of them said it with horror at what they had done. Some said it with cold annoyance at having backed the wrong horse. A few said it with genuine remorse. But most of them, in the privacy of what they believed to be a gentleman's drawing room, said the war had been deserved on the side that lost it. The microphones caught all of it. The Jewish refugees in the basement transcribed all of it. Lord Aberfeldy, who never existed, walked the grounds of Trent Park for 3 years, asking exactly the right questions in exactly the right places, and the men who answered him went to their graves, never knowing that history itself had been listening.